August 4th, 1964. The storm hit like a wall, waves towering over the decks of the USS Maddox, tossing the destroyer as if it were a toy. Lightning flashed, illuminating the dark, churning waters, and for a moment, the world seemed reduced to the violent rhythm of wind and rain. Radar blips danced across the screens, ghostly and insistent, while sonar operators shouted warnings that made hearts pound in the cramped control room. Torpedoes! Torpedoes in the water! A voice rang out, sharp and urgent, and somewhere deep in the belly of the ship, sailors gripped anything they could hold on to, knuckles white, teeth clenched. The guns roared to life, spitting fire into the blackness, each shell disappearing into the storm, leaving only echoes and smoke. Depth charges exploded beneath the waves, sending tremors through the hull, twisting the ship, forcing it to dance in an impossible rhythm. Hours bled into each other as the crew fired at shadows, at blips on screens, at sounds that might have been phantoms. Every heart on board was convinced of the attack, yet every glance into the rain-blurred night offered no proof, no enemy to strike back at. Commander Alan Grayson, eyes bloodshot and hands trembling, paced the bridge, listening to the chaos and wondering if all this fire and fury was chasing ghosts. Dawn arrived slowly, pale and gray, casting a hesitant light over the still, indifferent sea. The sailors searched, scanning the waters for debris, for the wreckage of torpedo boats, for any sign of the enemy they had fought so fiercely. There was nothing but the exhausted faces of men who had battled the invisible, the spray of the sea, and the lingering scent of gunpowder. Yet even as the sun climbed, a world away, President Johnson's voice was carried across the airwaves, declaring that acts of violence against American forces must be met with decisive action. Somewhere in the minds of men aboard the Maddox, a bitter awareness settled. The war they had prepared for, the battle they had lived through, had been conjured from the storm, the blips, and the fear itself, and the nation, unaware of the shadows behind the thunder and lightning, teetered on the edge of a war born from nothing but perception and politics. 2 days before the Maddox fired its first shells into the storm, the Gulf of Tonkin was already a theater of unseen violence. In the pre-dawn darkness, small South Vietnamese boats slipped silently toward the rocky North Vietnamese coastline, engines muffled, crews tense and methodical. Young men, barely out of their teens, carried rifles, satchels of explosives, and nerves sharpened to a razor's edge. They moved like shadows over the jagged rocks, every footstep calculated, every breath measured. Their orders were simple: strike the radar stations, sabotage the military depots, and vanish before dawn. Their training had come from the Americans, officers in crisp uniforms, faces half hidden under the dim glow of lanterns, their voices calm but resolute. They had drilled these men again and again, running through the motions of infiltrating, planting charges, withdrawing. The drills had been meticulous. The reality was unforgiving. Failure meant death. Farther out at sea, the destroyers lay in wait, the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy cutting through the dark waves with quiet determination. To anyone observing from above, they were performing routine reconnaissance, charts and logs recording their seemingly mundane patrols. But those on deck knew otherwise. Officers and radar operators exchanged coded messages, the hum of the sonar equipment a constant undercurrent to the tension on the bridge. Every blip on the screen was noted, recorded, relayed to South Vietnamese commandos and American intelligence alike. Officially, they were guarding international waters, ensuring freedom of navigation. In reality, they were the invisible eyes of an American shadow war, orchestrating strikes on foreign soil from hundreds of yards away. Lieutenant Michael Harrington stood at the bow of the Maddox, the salt spray lashing his face, eyes scanning the horizon that offered nothing but darkness. He was 19, with a steady hand and a mind that raced despite the calm he tried to maintain. He had joined the Navy for adventure, for purpose, for honor, but here, in the stillness of the night, he felt the dissonance of it all. He had watched South Vietnamese commandos, boys like him, take lives and destroy property on orders dictated thousands of miles away by men in offices he would never see. and he had passed that intelligence along, knowing that at dawn, the consequences would not be theoretical. Harrington shoved down the unease, reminding himself that in war, perspective was a luxury, and obedience was survival. Below deck, sonar operators strained to distinguish the ordinary groan of the ship against the distant thrum of the commando boats. Every ripple in the water, every faint echo, could signal enemy movement or merely the indifferent pulse of the sea. They had been trained to listen, to detect, to react, but here, in the Gulf of Tonkin, training collided with uncertainty. Lieutenant Commander Richard Callahan paced the cramped sonar room, flipping switches and monitoring screens, tension etching lines into his young face. "Keep your eyes open," he murmured, mostly to himself. Something will happen. He knew it already had, just not in the way most people would imagine. The men under his command were instruments in a covert symphony, playing notes whose melody would not be heard for years, if ever. Meanwhile, the commando boats crept closer to the North Vietnamese coast. A flash of moonlight caught the gleam of a rifle barrel. Explosions erupted silently against the night, sending plumes of smoke into the inky sky. Radar towers toppled with mechanical precision. Storage sheds collapsed under carefully placed charges. No one screamed. No one cried. Only the quiet satisfaction of mission completion filled the tense air. And then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness as quickly as they had arrived. No trace remained to mark their passage except the aftermath. Scorched earth, shattered equipment, and the faint echo of orders given across vast distances by men who would never see the destruction firsthand. Back on the destroyers, the crews monitored every moment with disciplined detachment. They relayed the successes, logged coordinates, and sent detailed reports to American intelligence. Officer Harrington finally allowed himself a brief glance at the water, the dark waves reflecting the explosions in streaks of orange and white, ephemeral and haunting. He thought of the men in those small boats, the young faces illuminated briefly by fire and lightning, carrying out acts that would soon be hidden behind euphemisms in memos, censored headlines, and classified documents. The gulf between the perception of war and its reality felt impossibly wide. In the mess hall, sailors tried to eat, though few had an appetite. Conversations were clipped, strained, like whispers in a house of glass. No one spoke of the raids directly. The language of orders and duty replaced narrative. But in stolen moments, whispers traveled between bunks. Some spoke of fear, others of pride. Few dared speak of doubt. That would be dangerous. The war at the edges of the Gulf of Tonkin was invisible to the nation but entirely present to those living it. And it was shaping the events that would soon explode into global awareness. By mid-morning, the commando raids had concluded. The men returned to waiting boats, faces hidden behind scarves and hoods, hands still shaking from adrenaline and cold. The destroyers maintained their positions offshore, screens alive with movement, listening for any sign of retaliation. And while North Vietnam attempted to comprehend the sudden strikes, the Americans were already planning their next moves. Orders would come from Washington. Escalate, observe, record, and conceal. The gulf, both literal and metaphorical, between the war being waged in secret and the war the public would soon be told about was now complete. The stage had been set, and all that remained was for a storm to arrive and for Maddox and Turner Joy to face shadows of the conflict they had already helped orchestrate. By nightfall on August 4th, when the radar blips flickered and the guns fired into the storm, the seeds sown by those secret raids would bloom into chaos. The ghost of action, real yet unseen, would guide decisions that could not be undone. For the men in the Gulf of Tonkin, duty was absolute. For the nation, the consequences would be catastrophic, yet almost invisible until it was too late. The war had begun before it was ever declared, in the dark, in silence, and in the hidden coordination of lives and machines that no one outside that water could comprehend. The Gulf was deceptively calm on August 2nd, the water reflecting a pale morning sun that seemed almost serene against the tensions brewing beneath its surface. On the deck of the USS Maddox, sonar operators and lookouts scanned the horizon with practiced diligence, unaware that the quiet beauty of the sea would soon shatter. Commander Alan Grayson stood on the bridge, his eyes tracing the distant line where water met sky, sensing the undercurrent of hostility that no one else yet recognized. The men on board were alert but relaxed, each carrying the confidence of routine, the assumption that today, like any other, would pass without incident. That assumption crumbled in the sudden flash of torpedo wake slicing through the water. 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats had emerged from the haze, engines spitting fury, their crews determined to strike back at the destruction visited upon their homeland just days earlier. Explosions from sabotaged radar towers and raided depots had reverberated across the coast, and these men carried the weight of retaliation in every tense grip of a steering wheel, in every tightening finger on a trigger. Grayson barked orders, heart pounding, as the Maddox maneuvered to evade, sending warning shots into the air, each report echoing across the waves. The tension was suffocating. Each man felt the fragile boundary between life and death, the immediate and irreversible. Below deck, sonar operators strained to interpret every sound. Torpedoes were detected, or perhaps imagined, a murky blur of water and machinery threatening to breach the hull. Lieutenant Michael Harrington, cold and alert, gripped the console, feeling the vibrations of the ship beneath his feet as if the vessel itself shuddered in fear. Around him, the men were tense, breathing rapid and shallow, muscles coiled for action, eyes fixed on screens that could not reveal the full truth of the approaching danger. The tension was electric, a living current flowing through the crew, each aware that a single misstep could spell catastrophe. As the Maddox returned fire, the roar of artillery and the clatter of deck guns filled the air. Tracer rounds lit up the morning sky in fractured arcs of light, a chaotic dance of fire against the soft blue backdrop. American jets from the USS Ticonderoga streaked overhead, strafing the attackers, their machine guns spitting lead in synchronized precision. For a moment, it felt like a war being waged by shadows and smoke, a surreal theater where the lines between combatants blurred in the heat of action. A bullet nicked the Maddox's hull, a minor wound in metal, but enough to remind every man on board of the stakes. The fragility of life hanging on orders, timing, and luck. Amid the chaos, Commander Grayson tried to maintain control. He issued commands, recalculated maneuvers, adjusted the ship's course, all while processing the dissonance between what was happening and what would soon be reported. The attack was provoked, a direct response to the covert operations, yet in the corridors of power back in Washington, the story was already being shaped into something unrecognizable. Harrington, watching through binoculars as enemy boats retreated, felt a gnawing unease. They had fought bravely, defended their ship, yet he knew the truth of the situation was at risk of being rewritten for audiences far removed from the salt and spray. By mid-afternoon, the immediate danger had passed. The torpedo boats withdrew to their hidden coves along the coast, their mission complete. The Maddox sustained minor damage, no lives lost, yet the psychological impact lingered. The crew, exhausted but resolute, cleaned weapons, repaired minor hull breaches, and tried to process the intensity of what had just occurred. Every sailor carried an invisible weight, the knowledge that they had been part of a violent encounter, justified yet framed differently for the public, interpreted differently for political purposes. Back in Washington, Johnson's advisors worked to craft the narrative that would reach Congress and the American people. The reality of provocation, the retaliatory nature of the attack, was quietly omitted. Briefings described the Maddox as on a routine patrol, attacked without warning, a target of aggression unprovoked and senseless. The first lie had been born. Documents and speeches reshaped the truth, distilling a complex situation into a simple story. Americans attacked in international waters, innocent and brave, needing immediate response. The gulf between the lived experience of the sailors and the political narrative was stark. Lieutenant Commander Richard Callahan, now back in his quarters, wrote in a journal he would never submit. The attack was real, yes, but it was a reaction, not an instigation. It was the culmination of a series of calculated moves and countermoves, a shadow war the public could not see. And yet, those in power chose to blur the lines, to package the encounter into a weapon for political advantage. Callahan's hand trembled slightly as he wrote, the weight of complicity heavy. History, he understood, would be told not by what happened on the waves, but by what words were chosen to travel across the Atlantic and into the chambers of Congress. Even as night fell over the Gulf, the men aboard the Maddox and Turner Joy remained vigilant, aware that their world had already shifted. Every radar blip, every distant engine hum, reminded them that their actions had consequences far beyond the waves beneath their feet. The line between reality and distortion was thin, easily crossed, and already the machinery of power was bending truth to its will. For Commander Grayson and his officers, the knowledge that what they had endured would soon be misrepresented gnawed at them quietly, a shadow hanging over their fatigue and relief. The first shots of August 2nd were fired in defense, real and tangible, yet they had set a precedent whose implications would ripple far beyond the Gulf. The attack was real, the response measured, yet the story that would reach the nation was distorted, a version curated to justify future actions and to manipulate public perception. Every man aboard the Maddox felt the tension between truth and the narrative, between the chaos of combat and the calm deceit that would follow. They had witnessed reality. The nation would be told a different story, and in that divergence, the machinery of war began turning, unstoppable, fueled not only by events but by the manipulation of their meaning. By midnight, the Gulf lay quiet once more, but the echo of August 2nd lingered. In the minds of sailors, it was a battle fought with courage and fear, with precision and chance. In the minds of politicians, it was a tool, a moment of justification, a story to be molded. And in the waters beneath the stars, the gulf between lived experience and reported truth stretched wider than the horizon, foreshadowing the chaos to come on August 4th, a phantom battle yet to be waged, built on the distorted memory of what had just occurred. August 4th arrived with a sky bruised by storm clouds, the Gulf of Tonkin churning as if the sea itself sensed the tension to come. The USS Maddox and Turner Joy pushed through waves that threatened to swallow them whole, spray stinging the faces of sailors and masking the horizon in sheets of gray. Lightning flickered across the water, illuminating the restless surface for split seconds, revealing nothing but the undulating motion of the storm. Commander John Herrick stood on the bridge of the Maddox, rain running down the collar of his uniform, eyes scanning the turbulent expanse, gut twisting with unease. 2 days after the real attack, they had returned not in search of battle but to assert presence, a show of strength. But nature had other plans, and the Gulf had become an unstable stage for the collision of human error, fear, and political ambition. Below deck, sonar operators hunched over their consoles, listening intently, straining to separate the constant roar of the ship from the imagined pulse of approaching torpedoes. The storm played tricks on every instrument, and every shadow on the radar seemed to have a life of its own. Lieutenant Michael Harrington, still a young sailor, wiped salt and sweat from his brow, heart pounding in rhythm with the vessel's engines. Multiple contacts, starboard, one operator shouted, voice tight with adrenaline. Another added, torpedoes heading straight for us. Instinct and training took over. Guns roared into the night, depth charges fell with violent force, the deck trembling under each detonation. Every man moved with precision, yet fear lingered in the edges of their vision, a silent partner in the chaos. For 2 relentless hours, the Maddox twisted and turned, evading invisible threats, firing at shadows that had no shape, no form, no reality. Each shell that erupted into the storm felt like a declaration, a desperate assertion that they were in control, even as the Gulf mocked them with its merciless winds and waves. Commander Herrick moved from station to station, issuing orders, checking reports, trying to thread certainty through the fog of war. And as reports piled in, contacts, torpedo tracks, explosions, the doubt began to gnaw at him. Something about this didn't fit. The radar blips were inconsistent, the sonar echoes erratic. The Gulf, alive with waves and wind, was creating illusions as much as it was sheltering truths. Herrick typed out a cable to Pacific Command, fingers trembling slightly as the words formed. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes appear doubtful. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Complete evaluation before further action recommended. He read it twice, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This was not insubordination. It was truth, delivered urgently, desperately, in the midst of chaos. Somewhere far away in Washington, the fate of nations would hang on the interpretation of his words. And yet, those words would be ignored. Hours later, in offices far from the storm-lashed decks, aides and advisors sifted through reports, looking not for certainty, but for justification. Political urgency, election year pressures, and Cold War anxieties demanded action. Johnson's team did not ask whether the attack was real. They asked how to respond. The cable from Herrick, the doubts of the men on the scene, the repeated caveats of caution, all became inconvenient footnotes in a story that was already being written. Back on deck, Lieutenant Harrington felt a growing sense of unease. Each radar blip seemed more ghost than threat, each sonar echo more phantom than reality. He glanced at his fellow sailors, faces grim, eyes wide, hands steady but trembling. No one dared speak aloud the thought that lingered behind every command. What if there is nothing there at all? The storm seemed to sense their hesitation, its wind whipping harder, waves rising with sudden violence, every splash and crash amplifying the illusion of attack. By midnight, the Maddox and Turner Joy had fired hundreds of shells, dropped depth charges, and executed evasive maneuvers with a precision born of fear. Exhaustion weighed on the crew like a lead blanket. Men sat slumped, uniforms soaked, muscles trembling, ears ringing from the thunder of their own weapons. Commander Herrick looked out across the storm, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. He could see nothing. Not a single torpedo, not a single enemy boat. The entire battle had taken place in echoes, shadows, and the frantic imaginations of men under pressure. He knew the truth, yet he also knew that truth might never matter. In Washington, the reports had arrived hours earlier. The cable, the doubts, the recommendations for evaluation, all ignored. Advisors drafted speeches, prepared briefings for Congress, and rehearsed declarations of unprovoked aggression. Reality was being reshaped to fit a narrative of crisis, a crisis that had not actually occurred. The men in office could manipulate perception, but they could not feel the storm on their faces, the trembling of sailors' hands, or the exhaustion that clung to every soaked uniform on the decks of the Gulf. On the destroyers, the storm finally began to ease, but its effects lingered. Radar screens blinked erratically, sonar systems hummed with phantom echoes, and every man aboard wrestled with the uncertainty that haunted them. Commander Herrick wrote again, a final note in the log. The contacts are likely false. Caution is advised. Confirmation needed. It was a warning and a plea, a voice of reason drowned out by the urgency of distant ambition. By the next morning, when the skies cleared and the first light fell across the restless waters, the Gulf appeared calm once more. But the damage had been done. Not in the ships, not in the men, but in the corridors of power. Decisions had been made, actions set in motion, and the machinery of war had begun turning based on shadows and uncertainty. The phantom attack, as the world would later call it, was born of misread instruments, human fear, and the willful blindness of those far from the storm. The sailors who lived through it would remember the terror, the chaos, and the relentless tension. Yet the story that reached the nation would frame their courage as a response to real aggression. In the Gulf of Tonkin, the storm had passed, but its echo remained. Herrick's doubts were real, the fears palpable, the danger imagined yet terrifyingly convincing. And across oceans, political ambition had seized the moment, turning illusion into justification, shaping a path toward escalation that no one aboard the Maddox or Turner Joy could have foreseen. Yet all would bear witness to in lives spent and decisions made. The battle had been fought without an enemy, and the consequences would reverberate far beyond the reach of storm and wave, carried into history by those who chose certainty over truth. After the phantom attack on August 4, 1964, Washington moved swiftly. President Lyndon Johnson faced an election year, with hawkish opponents accusing him of weakness against communism. The Gulf of Tonkin offered a crisis, real or imagined, that could serve both political and military purposes. Reports from Commander Herrick, warning that the contacts and torpedo reports were likely false, arrived in Washington hours before Johnson addressed Congress and the nation. Instead of cautious evaluation, the administration focused on crafting a narrative that emphasized unprovoked aggression. Doubt was inconvenient. Reality became secondary to political necessity. By nightfall, American jets were already bombing North Vietnamese positions. 2 days later, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara testified before Congress, claiming the attacks were unprovoked, that the destroyers had been on routine patrol, and that the United States had played no role in the preceding South Vietnamese raids. He omitted Oplan 34A entirely and ignored Commander Herrick's warnings. The testimony painted a picture of American innocence and justified retaliation. Congress, swayed by urgency and the desire to appear resolute, passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution overwhelmingly. The resolution granted Johnson unlimited authority to take all necessary measures in Vietnam, effectively a blank check for war, without formal declarations, debate, or scrutiny. Political ambition had overruled truth. Decades later, the Raal story came to light. The August 4th attack had never occurred. Radar blips were weather phenomena, sonar echoes were likely the destroyer's own propellers, and human error had created a convincing illusion of assault. McNamara, in retrospection, admitted the error. The cable from Commander Herrick, urging caution and full evaluation, had been ignored. Yet, the resolution remained, and its consequences were catastrophic. 58,000 American soldiers died, millions of Vietnamese perished, and troop levels escalated from a modest advisory presence to more than 500,000 by 1968. Johnson did not escalate because the attack was confirmed. He escalated because he needed it to be real. Political survival and Cold War pressures had substituted for verification of facts. The Gulf of Tonkin set a precedent that would haunt U.S. foreign policy for decades. Presidents learned that a crisis, even a manufactured or misinterpreted one, could justify rapid military escalation without congressional oversight. The War Powers Act of 1973 attempted to curb such abuses, but the lesson remained. Perception could substitute for reality, and expediency could outweigh truth. The moral and political implications are stark. Decisions made on misread instruments, uncertain reports, and ignored doubts led to irreversible human costs. Lives were sacrificed not because the facts demanded it, but because power demanded it. In the end, the Gulf of Tonkin demonstrates the terrifying ease with which perception can become policy. Ambition, urgency, and fear can transform uncertainty into action, truth into casualty. The moral question lingers. Power does not require truth, it only needs a crisis. Johnson's choice to act, to exploit uncertainty for political and strategic gain, reshaped American involvement in Vietnam and set a template for future conflicts. The lesson is haunting, timeless, and profoundly human. The machinery of government can, in moments of urgency, disregard reality, and the consequences are measured in lives lost and history rewritten.